The night was quiet in Arlington, Virginia. The hum of streetlights flickered above the empty sidewalks, and the occasional car sped down the deserted roads. Maya Lawson drove with ease, her hands relaxed on the wheel of her sleek black SUV. The tension of the past few weeks had finally begun to ease as her latest undercover assignment neared completion. She had everything she needed. The operation had been meticulously planned, and she had spent months embedded within a shadowy network, collecting intelligence. Tonight was supposed to be her quiet exit. One final drive home before she disappeared into the next phase of her mission. The clock on her dashboard read 12:06 a.m., just past midnight. Her instincts, honed through years of experience, kept her hyper-aware of her surroundings. A well-placed stop sign caught the glow of her headlights at a quiet intersection. She slowed to a complete stop, her eyes instinctively sweeping the road ahead, then turned left. It was only a few moments later that she saw them, the unmistakable glow of red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. The piercing wail of a siren shattered the stillness of the night. Maya's pulse remained steady. This wasn't fear. She didn't do fear, but her mind sharpened, working through the possibilities. Routine traffic stop? Unlikely? Coincidence? Even less so. Something was wrong. With practiced calm, she pulled her vehicle to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and exhaled slowly. Her left hand remained visible on the steering wheel as her right reached into the glove compartment for her license and registration. No sudden movements, no room for escalation. The patrol car pulled up close behind her, its headlights casting long shadows across the dashboard. She could see the silhouettes of two officers stepping out, moving with deliberate precision. The taller one approached first, Officer Ethan Wallace. He had a square jaw, a hard gaze, and the kind of practiced authority that suggested he enjoyed being in control. Behind him, Officer Greg Mason, shorter and stockier, flanked the vehicle, his posture tense with barely contained smugness. Maya noted their names as they drew closer. Her training taught her that every detail mattered. Wallace knocked once on the window with the butt of his flashlight, his expression unreadable as he peered inside. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a forced politeness. "Know why I pulled you over tonight?" Maya met his gaze evenly, keeping her tone calm but firm. "No, officer, I wasn't speeding, and I came to a full stop at the intersection." Wallace tilted his head, a small, almost amused smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Actually," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing edge, "you didn't stop back there. That's a moving violation." Maya narrowed her eyes slightly but didn't argue. She knew she had stopped. She had an instinct for details, and she didn't miss things like that. But debating wouldn't get her anywhere. "I'm certain I stopped, officer," she replied smoothly. "Perhaps you—" "License and registration," Wallace cut her off, the polite facade slipping away. She handed him the documents without hesitation, her movements slow, deliberate. No need to give them a reason to escalate this. Wallace studied her license, his eyes flicking over the Virginia plates and local address. "You live around here?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes, officer," she replied. Behind them, Mason was lingering near the back of her vehicle, a beat of silence. Then, "Hey, Wallace, you might want to take a look at this." Maya watched in her side mirror as Wallace handed back her documents with pointed indifference. "Stay in the car," he ordered before turning on his heel to join his partner at the rear. Maya's jaw tightened slightly, though her expression remained neutral. She saw the way Mason was gesturing theatrically, the exaggerated tilt of his shoulders as he pointed into the open trunk. Something was wrong. Wallace crouched slightly, peering inside. Then, slowly, he straightened, exchanging a glance with Mason, one that sent a flicker of unease through Maya's chest. This wasn't a random stop. Wallace returned to her window, his expression now dark, businesslike. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly. "May I ask why?" Wallace's tone hardened. "We've got reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances." There it was, the play, the setup. Maya didn't blink, didn't react. Instead, she let the moment stretch between them before responding in a flat, even tone. "Illegal substances?" she repeated, as if testing the words. "I think you've made a mistake." Mason chuckled from behind the car, his voice thick with mock surprise. "Oh, I don't think so," he said, lifting a small unmarked bag from the trunk. The powdery contents gleamed under the streetlight. What do you know? A bag of premium-grade trouble. Maya's gaze flicked to the bag and then back to the officers. Her face remained unreadable, but inside, her mind was working rapidly, analyzing every detail, every possible next move. That bag hadn't been there when she left her house. She knew that. This was a setup. Wallace took a step closer, arms crossed over his chest. "Anything you want to tell us, ma'am?" Maya's lips curved ever so slightly. Not a smile, but a subtle, calculated expression that conveyed neither fear nor guilt. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting," she said, voice smooth as glass. Wallace chuckled, clearly mistaking her composure for arrogance. "Oh, you'll have your chance," he said. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." Mason stepped forward, reaching for his cuffs. Maya allowed it. She let them think they had won. As the cold metal snapped around her wrists, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze calm but sharp. "You're making a mistake," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Mason hesitate for half a second before tightening the cuffs. "Yeah, we'll see," Wallace muttered, leading her toward the squad car. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge." As they drove away, Maya gazed out the window, her expression serene. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The police station was eerily quiet when Maya Lawson stepped inside, her hands still bound in cold steel. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant, the harsh fluorescent lights above casting an unforgiving glow over scuffed linoleum floors and peeling paint. Behind her, Officers Ethan Wallace and Greg Mason walked with an air of self-satisfaction, their smug grins evident even without looking. "Got ourselves a big one tonight," Wallace announced loudly, his voice carrying through the station like a declaration of victory. Mason chuckled, tossing the small, unmarked bag of powder onto the processing counter with a theatrical flip of his wrist. "Caught her red-handed," Mason added. "Looks like she's been running more than just stop signs." Several officers at nearby desks glanced up, some with mild interest, others barely acknowledging the scene at all. This was just another ordinary night to them, another routine arrest. Except this was anything but routine. Maya stood motionless, her posture relaxed yet calculated, as though she had all the time in the world. Wallace expected fear. Mason expected defensiveness. What they got was silence. Maya let the moment stretch, her gaze cool and unreadable as she took in every detail of the room. The placement of the security cameras, the positions of the officers, the doors leading in and out, every observation cataloged and stored for later use. It was a well-rehearsed act, and she had perfected it over years of playing the long game. The young officer's doubt. Behind the processing desk, Officer Ryan Carter sat at his computer, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He was new to the force, still figuring out his place in the hierarchy. But he had already learned that men like Wallace and Mason ran the station. They were respected, if not outright feared, and questioning them was not an option. Still, something about this didn't sit right. Carter looked at Maya. She didn't fit the profile. Most people brought in on drug charges were either aggressive or terrified, either shouting their innocence or resigned to their fate. But Maya was neither. She wasn't shaken. She wasn't nervous. She didn't look guilty or scared. She just looked patient. That unsettled him. "Name?" Carter asked, his voice quieter than intended. "Maya Lawson," she answered, her tone even. "Occupation?" Maya hesitated only for a fraction of a second, just enough to make it look natural. "Consultant," she said finally. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. Carter's fingers tapped against his desk as he processed her response. Her clothing was too sharp, her demeanor too polished for someone caught trafficking drugs in the middle of the night. He frowned slightly, his unease growing. But Wallace and Mason didn't notice. They were too busy laughing quietly near the coffee machine, enjoying their victory lap. The silent signal. Maya kept her breathing slow, even as she shifted her wrist just enough to press a nearly imperceptible switch embedded in the hem of her jacket. A silent signal, a triggered beacon. Somewhere, miles away in a secure operations center, a nondescript phone would buzz softly on a desk. A hand would reach out to answer it. Signal received, location confirmed. Her team was now watching, listening, moving. She didn't need to explain. They would know what to do. The first seeds of doubt. Carter continued typing up the arrest report, but something about the whole situation bothered him more and more. He glanced up at Maya, his curiosity outweighing his caution. "Did you really consent to the search?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Maya studied him carefully before answering. "What do you think, Officer Carter?" Carter hesitated. He felt the heat of Wallace and Mason's presence behind him, their laughter still echoing in the room. He swallowed hard. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered. "That's what they're counting on," Maya said quietly. Carter's stomach twisted. He knew what she meant. He just didn't want to admit it. The officers celebrate too soon. Across the room, Wallace clapped Mason on the back, grinning like a man who had already won the war. "That's another one in the books," Wallace said. Mason chuckled. "They always think they're smarter than us, don't they?" Wallace took a sip of his lukewarm coffee, his smirk widening. "Yeah, but they never are." Neither of them noticed Carter lingering by his computer, his face pale, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard. Neither of them saw the storm brewing, but Maya did, and she knew. This was only the beginning. Officer Ryan Carter sat at his desk, fingers drumming absently against the wood, his eyes fixed on his computer screen, but not really reading the words in front of him. Something felt wrong. He exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair, glancing toward the holding cells. Through the small security monitor mounted above his desk, he could see her, Maya Lawson, sitting calmly on the metal bench inside her cell, as still as a statue. She hadn't panicked, she hadn't pleaded, and that was the problem. Ryan had processed dozens of arrests in his first few months on the force, but this one felt too clean. He clicked open her case file again, reading through Wallace and Mason's arrest report. The words looked familiar, eerily so. Driver failed to yield at a marked intersection. Driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning. Consented to search. Controlled substances found in vehicle. Ryan frowned. That exact phrasing sounded too much like previous reports he had seen. He switched to another case file, then another, each one nearly identical. The arrests followed the same sequence of events, the same traffic stops, the same conveniently placed evidence. And most of the individuals charged, all minorities. His gut twisted. Ryan wasn't naive. He had joined the force to serve and protect. But even in his short time here, he had seen how things really worked. Wallace and Mason were untouchable, and no one questioned them. But now, he was questioning them. He glanced toward the break room, where Wallace and Mason were still chatting and laughing over coffee, acting as if nothing was out of the ordinary. For them, it wasn't. Ryan's hands clenched into fists. Something about Maya Lawson's case wasn't right. And if she had been set up, how many others had suffered the same fate? Meanwhile, inside the holding cell, Maya sat with her back straight, her eyes half-lidded in mock relaxation, but her mind was sharp and calculating. She had spent the past hour mapping the station in her head, noting the placement of security cameras, the number of officers on shift, who lingered where and who ignored what. It was a small station, nothing like the federal buildings she was used to infiltrating, but that worked in her favor. Fewer people meant fewer complications. The door to the holding area buzzed open. Ryan stepped inside. Maya didn't move, only lifting her gaze to meet his, studying him with the same careful precision she had used on warlords and terrorists in foreign countries. He stopped just outside her cell, his fingers gripping the bars. "You said earlier that I should think about it," he said, his voice quieter than before. "About whether or not you really consented to the search." Maya tilted her head slightly. "And what conclusion have you come to, Officer Carter?" Ryan shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. That's the problem." Maya let the silence settle between them, watching him struggle with the weight of his own conscience. "Tell me," she said finally, her tone light, almost conversational. "When was the last time you actually saw someone voluntarily agree to a vehicle search at midnight when they knew they had drugs in the trunk?" Ryan exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know." "Because it doesn't happen," Maya continued, her voice soft, but edged with an undeniable certainty. "No one consents to a search when they know they're guilty. But it's a great sentence to put in a report, isn't it?" Ryan stared at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and left. Maya watched him go, a small, knowing smile barely tugging at the corner of her lips. The first crack in the foundation had appeared. Uncovering the truth. Back at his desk, Ryan's fingers flew over his keyboard, his pulse hammering in his ears. He pulled up security footage from earlier that night. Maya's SUV came to a full stop at the intersection. Wallace and Mason's patrol car was already waiting nearby, as if they had been expecting her. The traffic stop unfolded exactly as they had written it in their report, but then something didn't match. Ryan paused the footage, his stomach twisting. He rewound, paused again. Mason was holding the unmarked bag before they had even opened Maya's trunk. His blood ran cold. They had planted it. Ryan's breath came slow and measured as the realization settled in. This wasn't just one mistake. This was deliberate. He looked back at Maya's holding cell monitor. She was still sitting there, calm, patient, almost as if she already knew he would figure it out. Meanwhile, the extraction plan is set in motion. Across town, in a secure CIA facility, a dimly lit operations room was alive with quiet urgency. A large monitor displayed a blinking dot on a map, the signal Maya had activated earlier. Agent Daniel Cross leaned over a desk, his expression unreadable as he studied the location. "She made contact," one of the analysts confirmed. "Her tracker is live." Cross nodded. "Get the team in place. We don't move until she gives the go-ahead. But we need eyes inside that station." A second agent typed rapidly, pulling up police records, officer profiles, and station blueprints. Another agent standing near the doorway crossed his arms. "She's cutting it close this time." Cross's lips curled into the faintest smirk. "She always does." Back at the station, Ryan sat motionless, staring at his screen. He could feel the weight of what he had just discovered pressing down on him. Wallace and Mason had lied. They had set her up. And if they had done it to Maya, how many others had been railroaded into convictions? Ryan felt something inside him shift, something he had been trying to suppress since the day he joined the force. Doubt. Doubt in the men he looked up to. Doubt in the system he had sworn to uphold. He looked toward the break room, where Wallace and Mason were still laughing, still oblivious. And then he looked back at Maya's holding cell. She wasn't oblivious at all. She was waiting. And now, so was he, waiting for the moment when everything came crashing down. Officer Ryan Carter sat at his desk, staring at his screen, but not really seeing it. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, the weight of the decision before him pressing down like a vice. He had spent the last 2 hours quietly digging through arrest records, searching for patterns, and what he found made his stomach churn. Wallace and Mason's names appeared again and again, tied to arrests that followed the same suspicious pattern. Minor traffic violations escalating into felony drug charges. Evidence appearing out of nowhere. No body cam footage conveniently recorded for key moments. Most of the suspects, people of color. Ryan swallowed hard, his throat dry. This wasn't just one bad arrest. This was a system, a method, a routine, a way to control, intimidate, and climb the ranks at the expense of innocent people. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. His badge sat on the desk beside him, gleaming under the fluorescent light, a symbol of the oath he had taken. To serve and protect. Was this what that meant? Meanwhile, Maya waits and watches. Inside her holding cell, Maya Lawson remained exactly where she had been since the moment she was placed there, her back straight, her hands resting loosely on her lap, her breathing calm and steady. She had perfected the art of patience. The hum of the station's activity drifted through the metal bars, voices carrying from the bullpen. Every conversation, every laugh, every hushed murmur was another piece of information to be logged away. She noticed things. The officer rotations, who lingered in the hallways, who passed her cell without looking. The security cameras, poorly placed, likely outdated. The rookie cop who kept looking at her like he was unraveling a secret he wasn't ready to face. Ryan Carter. She had seen the doubt in his eyes earlier, the hesitation, the discomfort. He was still wrestling with his conscience. That meant he wasn't fully lost yet, and that meant he could still be useful. Wallace and Mason take notice. In the break room, Ethan Wallace and Greg Mason sat across from each other, their coffee cooling in forgotten mugs. Wallace drummed his fingers against the table. "You notice Carter today?" Mason snorted, shaking his head. "Kid looks like he saw a ghost." Wallace leaned back, his expression turning serious. "He's been digging." Mason stiffened slightly. "What do you mean?" "He was on the system earlier, poking around old cases. Hours." A pause. Then Mason scowled. "You think he knows?" Wallace exhaled through his nose, considering it. "Number? Not yet. But he's starting to put things together. And that's a problem." Mason's jaw clenched. "I'll talk to him." Wallace gave him a knowing look. "Make sure he gets the message." Mason smirked. "Oh, he will." The warning. Ryan was halfway to the records room when Mason's voice stopped him cold. "Hey, rookie." Ryan turned slowly to find Mason leaning against the hallway wall, arms crossed, expression casual, but his eyes said something different. Ryan forced himself to keep his face neutral. "Yeah?" Mason pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "You've been busy today," he said, voice low. Ryan's stomach tightened, but he shrugged. "Just catching up on reports." Mason let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Cut the crap, Carter. I see what you're doing." Ryan forced himself to hold Mason's gaze, even as a prickle of unease crawled up his spine. "You don't ask questions around here," Mason continued. "You follow orders. You do your job. You look the other way when you're supposed to." Ryan's jaw tightened. "And if I don't?" Mason smirked, stepping even closer. "Then maybe you don't belong here." A long, tense silence stretched between them. Then Mason clapped a hand on Ryan's shoulder, squeezing a little too tightly. "Think about it," he murmured before walking off. Ryan stood there, his pulse pounding in his ears. His gut was telling him what he already knew. If he kept pushing, he would be painting a target on his back. But if he let it go, then he was just as guilty as them. The decision. Ryan returned to his desk, his mind a storm of conflict. Mason's words echoed in his head. "You don't ask questions." But he had already asked them. And he had found the answers. Now, the only thing left to do was act. His hands were steady as he opened an anonymous email server. His heart hammered as he attached the files he had found, the case numbers, the arrest reports, the evidence of falsified statements. To Federal Internal Affairs Division. Subject: Corruption in Arlington PD. Message: This is happening in your jurisdiction. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help. Ryan stared at the cursor blinking at the bottom of the screen. Once he hit send, there was no turning back. His finger hovered for a brief moment. Then, click. The message disappeared into the void. Ryan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his hands finally trembling. Whatever happened next, he had made his choice, and the storm was coming. The CIA intercepts the tip. Inside a secure operations room in a nondescript CIA facility, Agent Daniel Cross stood over a row of monitors, his gaze locked onto the blinking signal on the screen. The encrypted email had come through their system just minutes ago. Cross glanced at the message again, his jaw tightening. To Federal Internal Affairs Division. Subject: Corruption in Arlington PD. This is happening in your jurisdiction. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help. Who sent this? He asked, his voice low and measured. One of the analysts at the desk tapped rapidly on her keyboard, decrypting the metadata. It came from inside the Arlington Police Department, she replied. Looks like an officer? Cross nodded slowly, his mind already piecing things together. Maya's silent distress signal. Now, an internal whistleblower confirming corruption. It was time to move. Get me the FBI, Cross ordered. This just became a federal matter. The FBI gets involved. The first calls were discreet, a quiet coordination between agencies, ensuring that no one inside Arlington PD would be tipped off too soon. By midday, federal inquiries had begun, filtering through state oversight divisions, questioning case records, conviction reports, and procedural discrepancies. The walls around Wallace and Mason were starting to close in, and they didn't even know it yet. Suspicion takes root. Inside the station, Wallace leaned against his desk, flipping through a case file, but his focus was elsewhere. Something felt off. First, there was Carter's sudden interest in past arrests. Then, there were inquiries from internal affairs, asking about specific procedures, specific names. His instincts, the same ones that had kept him one step ahead for years, were sending warning signals through his body like fire alarms. He turned to Mason. "You feel that?" he asked. Mason frowned. "Feel what?" Wallace scanned the room. "Something's coming." Mason scoffed, taking a sip of his coffee. "Relax, man. We've handled worse." But Wallace wasn't convinced. The rookie faces the heat. In a cramped office at the back of the station, Ryan Carter sat rigidly in a chair, his hands folded in his lap. Across from him, Lieutenant Henry Dawson, a man who had been with the force for 20 years, leaned forward, arms crossed. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately," Dawson said, his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp. Ryan swallowed. "Just trying to be thorough, sir." Dawson held his gaze for a long moment before shaking his head. "Listen to me, Carter. You're new here, so I'll give you some advice. You don't want to get caught in the middle of something you don't understand." Ryan felt the warning behind the words. This wasn't just about protecting Wallace and Mason. It was about protecting everyone who had allowed this corruption to go unchecked. "I'm just doing my job," Ryan said carefully. Dawson leaned back, exhaling. "You don't want to make enemies here, kid." Ryan said nothing, because it was too late for that. The tension spreads. Word moved fast through the station. Officers spoke in hushed whispers, speculating about why Internal Affairs was sniffing around. People who had never questioned anything before were suddenly double-checking their reports, their arrest records, their procedures, just in case. Wallace and Mason felt the shift. "Someone's talking," Wallace murmured, Mason's jaw clenched. "You think it's Carter?" Wallace didn't answer, but he had a feeling, and if Carter had gone to someone outside the department, then they were all screwed. Maya senses the reckoning. Back in her holding cell, Maya felt it too. The subtle change in the air, the tension spreading like a slow-moving wildfire. Officers lingered less near her cell, their casual indifference replaced by quiet unease. The dynamics had shifted. She could feel the weight of an approaching storm, a familiar sensation she had learned to recognize over years of operations, takedowns, and strategic dismantlings. It meant one thing: the reckoning was close. Maya allowed herself a small, knowing smile. It wouldn't be long now. The FBI arrives. The station was buzzing with morning activity when the front doors swung open, and a group of men and women in the dark suits stepped inside. There was no warning, no pretense, just the sudden arrival of federal agents, moving with deliberate purpose. At the lead, Agent Daniel Cross flashed his credentials to the desk sergeant. "FBI, we have a warrant to seize all department records, case files, and internal surveillance footage." The room fell into stunned silence. Officers stopped mid-conversation. Phones rang unanswered. The hum of printers and keyboards stuttered into stillness. The sergeant's mouth opened, but no words came out. Because this wasn't a routine visit. This was a takedown in real time, and everyone knew it. Wallace and Mason feel the heat. From across the bullpen, Ethan Wallace and Greg Mason watch the scene unfold, their blood turning cold. Wallace's fingers tightened around his coffee mug, but he didn't take a sip. Mason leaned in. "This is about us," he muttered. Wallace exhaled slowly, scanning the room. His instincts were screaming at him now. This was not an inquiry, not a procedural review. This was a trap closing around them. "We need to shut this down," Mason hissed. Wallace's mind was already spinning through damage control options. Maybe they could alter records, delete files, shift blame. But then he saw Agent Cross walking straight toward Carter's desk, and suddenly, he knew. Carter had flipped. Ryan meets Agent Cross. Ryan Carter had barely slept the night before. He had spent the past few hours waiting for something to happen, for a sign that his anonymous tip had been received, taken seriously. And now, here it was. He watched as Agent Cross approached his desk, his heart pounding. The older man's expression was unreadable, but there was a weight to his presence, something that made it clear. He already knew everything. "You're Ryan Carter?" Cross asked. Ryan nodded. "Yes, sir." Cross glanced around, lowering his voice just slightly. "You sent the tip." It wasn't a question. Ryan swallowed. Yeah. A pause, then, "You did the right thing," Cross said simply. Ryan exhaled, something in his chest loosening just slightly. Then Cross straightened, his voice returning to its businesslike tone. "I need access to your surveillance logs, case records, and anything else that might confirm misconduct by Officers Wallace and Mason." Ryan nodded quickly, his hands already moving over the keyboard. For the first time since joining the force, he felt like he was actually doing something that mattered. Maya's quiet release. Inside the holding cell, Maya had been waiting for this moment. She had felt the shift in the station's energy, the ripple effect of panic as the realization spread. The walls were closing in. Now, an FBI agent unlocked the door, stepping aside to let her out. "Ms. Lawson, you're free to go." Maya didn't react right away, keeping her movements slow, deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. She met the agent's gaze. "No charges?" He shook his head. "None that will stick." She tilted her head slightly, a ghost of a smile forming. "Good." She stepped out, her posture as composed as ever. She knew she could walk out that door and disappear forever, just like she always did. But she wasn't done watching. Not yet. Wallace and Mason's last-ditch effort. Inside a small back office, Wallace and Mason huddled over a computer, frantically searching through files. "Delete everything tied to Lawson," Wallace snapped. Mason was already clicking through case records, his hands shaking slightly. But before he could reach the file, the screen suddenly froze. A blinking message appeared. "Access denied. Files locked under federal warrant." Mason let out a string of curses, slamming his fist against the desk. Wallace stepped back, his mind racing. This was it. The evidence was out of their hands. The investigation was moving forward, with or without them. For the first time in years, Wallace felt something he hadn't felt before. Real fear. The walls close in. Ryan watched from across the station, his pulse hammering as Wallace and Mason stepped out of the office, their faces pale. They knew. And worse, they knew he was the one who had exposed them. For a brief moment, Wallace's gaze locked onto his. Something dangerous flickered there. Anger, betrayal, but also defeat. Ryan stood his ground, gripping the edge of his desk, reminding himself of what Cross had told him. You did the right thing. The storm had arrived, and it was too late for Wallace and Mason to stop it now. Wallace and Mason, the noose tightens. In a dimly lit back office of the Arlington Police Department, Ethan Wallace and Greg Mason sat in tense silence. The station was in chaos. FBI agents combed through files, officers whispered nervously, and the tension was thick enough to suffocate. Wallace ran a hand through his hair, his normally composed demeanor crumbling. "We need a way out," Mason muttered, his leg bouncing. "We're screwed, Ethan. They've got the files, the footage. Carter flipped on us." "Shut up," Wallace snapped. Mason clenched his jaw but didn't argue. The options were shrinking fast. They could try to run, but they wouldn't get far. The FBI was watching them now. They could pin it on someone else, but with the evidence piling up, no one was going to buy it. Mason let out a bitter laugh. "We could say it was Carter." Wallace's eyes flicked toward the hallway, his expression unreadable. "Carter's already made his move," Wallace muttered. "He's too deep in with the feds now." Mason leaned forward, voice dropping lower. "Then we make sure he doesn't testify." Wallace stared at him, the unspoken meaning hanging between them. But even as Mason suggested it, they both knew. It was already too late. Maya watches it all unfold. Across the street from the station, Maya Lawson sat inside a black sedan, eyes trained on the building. She held a phone to her ear. "Give me a status update." Agent Daniel Cross's voice came through the line, steady as ever. "FBI has everything they need," he confirmed. "They'll be making arrests soon." Maya's lips curled into a slight smile. "Good." She could see the pieces falling apart from a distance. The way officers walked past Wallace and Mason without looking at them. The way the department that once enabled them was now pretending not to know them. Their power had been stripped away, and there was nothing they could do about it. Ryan's decision to testify. Inside the station, Ryan Carter sat across from two FBI agents, his hands folded tightly. "You understand what this means," Agent Cross said, watching him carefully. "If you testify, you become a whistleblower. There's no going back." Ryan swallowed. "I know." His pulse was steady now. He had already made his choice the moment he sent that tip. "I'll do it," he said. Cross nodded. "You're doing the right thing." Ryan exhaled, feeling a strange sense of clarity. For the first time since he joined the force, he wasn't questioning himself. The police chief's press conference. By that evening, the Arlington Police Department scrambled to save face. At the front steps of the station, Chief Howard Bryant stood before a podium, flanked by senior officers, cameras flashing in his face. "The Arlington Police Department is committed to accountability and justice," Bryant said, his voice firm. "We do not and will not tolerate corruption within our ranks." The words sounded strong, decisive, but inside the station everyone knew this was damage control. And for Wallace and Mason, the speech was a death sentence. Wallace makes his move. Ryan had just finished closing out his desk for the night when a shadow fell over him. Wallace. Ryan's stomach clenched, but he forced himself to stand his ground. Wallace smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Brave move, Carter," he said smoothly. "You really think this is going to end well for you?" Ryan didn't flinch. "You set people up," he said, voice stronger than he expected. "You think you can walk away from that?" Wallace stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're making a mistake." Ryan met his gaze. "No," he said. "You did." For the first time, Wallace had no response, and Ryan walked away, leaving Wallace standing alone in the wreckage of his own making. Yachts Wallace and Mason are arrested. The moment Ethan Wallace and Greg Mason had feared arrived at dawn. FBI agents stormed their homes, their knocks turning into pounding fists against doors that were no longer theirs to control. Mason was still half asleep when he opened the door, only to be shoved against the wall, cold metal cuffs snapping shut around his wrists. Wallace was already dressed, as if he had spent the entire night waiting for this moment. He didn't fight, didn't resist, just stared ahead, jaw clenched. "You have the right to remain silent." But for once in his life, Ethan Wallace had nothing to say. By the time the news broke, the department was already in flames. Headlines screamed across every major outlet. FBI arrests, 2 Arlington officers, and widespread corruption. Scandal police officers caught, fabricating evidence, dozens of convictions under review. "Justice will be served," says federal prosecutor in press release. Inside the police station, officers who once laughed and drank with Wallace and Mason now spoke about them in hushed tones, their names suddenly a liability. No one wanted to be associated with the sinking ship. And as Wallace and Mason were escorted into the courthouse, surrounded by flashing cameras, they realized the inevitable truth. They were alone. The courtroom showdown. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, lawyers, off-duty officers who wanted to see how deep the rot ran. And in the back row, Maya Lawson sat quietly, watching it all unfold. She was a ghost to them, an unknown variable in the story, and she preferred it that way. She had done her job. Now, it was time for the truth to speak for itself. The prosecution wasted no time. "Your Honor, what we present today is not just a case of individual corruption, but a calculated, deliberate pattern of abuse by officers Ethan Wallace and Greg Mason. They played the security footage first, the damning, inarguable proof. Mason holding the unmarked bag before Maya's trunk was even opened. Wallace nodding knowingly before the discovery was announced. The smug laughter they shared in the break room, talking about airtight cases. The jury watched in silence. Then came the falsified reports. The copy-paste narratives they had used on dozens of cases, each one echoing the same words. Driver exhibited nervous behavior. Driver consented to search. Illegal substances found. Except now, the FBI had evidence to prove otherwise. Ryan takes the stand. The courtroom shifted when Ryan Carter was called to testify. Wallace, sitting at the defense table, stiffened. For a brief moment, he and Ryan locked eyes, a silent battle of will. Then Ryan took his seat, swore his oath, and told the truth. "I joined the Arlington Police Department because I believed in the job," Ryan began, his voice steady. I believed in what it meant to protect and serve, he exhaled. But what I saw, it wasn't protection. It wasn't justice. It was a system built to target the vulnerable, to frame innocent people, and to cover up the crimes of the people in power. Wallace shook his head, his jaw tight, but Ryan pressed on. I uncovered arrest reports that didn't match reality, surveillance footage that told a different story than the paperwork, and officers, people I thought I could trust, who laughed while planting evidence. His hands gripped the edges of the stand, his voice clear and unwavering. I couldn't be part of it, so I exposed it. The courtroom murmured, the weight of his words settling like a heavy stone. Wallace looked away, because he knew. This was the end. The judge's final word. When the judge spoke, his voice was filled with measured disgust. What I see before me today is not just an abuse of power, he said, his eyes locked on Wallace and Mason. It is an offense to the very oath you swore to uphold. Wallace's fingers tightened into fists, his breathing heavy. Mason sat frozen, as if the reality of their fate was only now truly sinking in. The judge's next words sealed their fate. Ethan Wallace and Greg Mason, you are hereby found guilty on all counts. The gavel slammed down, and with it, the finality of their fall from power. The aftermath? The court adjourned, and the whispers began immediately. The police department was fractured, the legacy of Wallace and Mason a stain that wouldn't wash away. Inside the now silent courtroom, Maya watched as officers in uniform led Wallace and Mason away in handcuffs. Once, they had stood in the same position, leading innocent people to a fate they never deserved. Now, it was their turn. She stood, sliding her hands into her pockets, and quietly left through the back exit. Her work here was done, and justice had been served. A town shaken by scandal. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The Arlington Police Department, once a pillar of the community, had become a symbol of corruption. The morning after Wallace and Mason's conviction, protesters gathered outside the station, their voices loud, their signs damning. Justice for the wrongfully convicted. Hold them all accountable. Reform the system now. News vans lined the streets, reporters scrambling to cover every angle of the scandal that had shaken the town to its core. The department scrambled to control the damage, but the truth was already out. Within a week, the first wave of resignations hit. High-ranking officials stepped down under pressure, some quietly leaving, others forced out by public demand. Officers with records of misconduct tied to Wallace and Mason were placed under review. The police chief, who had once tried to downplay the case, was forced to resign, his credibility shattered. For years, people had whispered about corruption in the department. Now, they screamed it. Justice for the wrongfully convicted. The most significant fallout came in the courtroom. With FBI evidence proving Wallace and Mason had falsified reports and planted evidence, past convictions were overturned one by one. The first man to be released, a 22-year-old named Darius Reed, had served 4 years for a crime he didn't commit. The moment he walked out of prison, his mother collapsed into his arms, sobbing. Cameras captured every moment. His words, spoken through tears and anger, made headlines. They stole 4 years of my life. How many more lives did they ruin? And Darius was just one of many. Every overturned case was another reminder of the lives destroyed by Wallace and Mason's corruption. The people they framed weren't just numbers on a page. They were fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, people who had lost jobs, families, futures, and now they were finally free. But no one could give them back what had been taken. Ryan Carter, hero or traitor? Inside the police department, Ryan Carter had become a walking controversy. Some officers shook his hand, thanked him for doing what they never had the courage to do. Others, they refused to even look at him. The whispers followed him through the hallways. Snitch. He betrayed the badge. We're supposed to protect our own. Ryan tried to block out the voices, but the weight of it pressed down on him. He had done the right thing, so why did it feel like he was standing alone? Maya's final conversation with Ryan had just stepped outside the station, ready to escape the suffocating atmosphere, when he heard a familiar voice. "You look tired, Officer Carter." Ryan turned. Maya Lawson stood near the curb, hands in her pockets, watching him with the same calm intensity she always had. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, it's been a hell of a week." Maya smirked slightly. "I imagine so." Ryan looked at her, hesitant. "You sticking around?" She shook her head. "Number, my part in this is done." Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "Must be nice. I still have to deal with the fallout." Maya studied him for a moment, then tilted her head. "You did the right thing, Carter. You know that, right?" Ryan hesitated. "Then why does it still feel like I lost?" Maya's expression softened just a fraction. "Because you did," she said simply. Ryan blinked. "What?" "You lost the illusion that the system was working. You lost the belief that wearing a badge automatically meant doing the right thing," she said. She let the words settle before adding, "That's not a bad thing. It just means you see clearly now." Ryan looked away, the truth of her words hitting deeper than he wanted to admit. "You'll have a choice to make soon," Maya continued. "You can stay in that department and try to change it from within, or you walk away, knowing you did your part." Ryan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "And if I stay?" Maya's eyes glinted. "Then you fight, but don't expect them to thank you for it." A long silence stretched between them. Then Maya turned to leave, but before she walked away, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said over her shoulder, "you did more than just expose corruption." Ryan frowned. "What do you mean?" Maya's lips curved slightly. "You proved the system can be beaten. That's the part they're really afraid of." And with that, she was gone. Agent Cross ensures reform. In a Washington, D.C. conference room, Agent Daniel Cross sat at the head of a long table, across from federal prosecutors and Justice Department officials. Wallace and Mason were symptoms of a larger problem, one prosecutor admitted. Cross nodded. "Which is why this can't stop at just 2 officers. The plan was already in motion. Federal oversight was being put in place to monitor Arlington PD. New policies were being drafted to prevent future abuses. Statewide reviews were underway to examine every conviction made under questionable officers. The corruption had been rooted out. Now it was about making sure it never grew back." The beginning of something new. As the days passed, the storm began to settle, but its impact would last forever. Arlington had changed. The police department would never be the same. And Ryan Carter, for the first time since joining the force, he wasn't sure if he belonged there anymore. But one thing was certain, he had no regrets, and whatever came next, he was ready for it. Wallace and Mason faced their fate. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict. Ethan Wallace and Greg Mason sat at the defendant's table, their once proud uniforms replaced by prison jumpsuits. The weight of weeks of damning testimony, irrefutable evidence, and public outrage had left them worn down, hollow-eyed, and defeated. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was cold and resolute. "This court finds both defendants guilty on all counts, including conspiracy, falsification of evidence, and obstruction of justice," he said. Wallace stared ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly that a vein pulsed in his neck. Mason exhaled shakily, his hands trembling against the table. "You have not only disgraced your department," the judge continued, "but you have irreparably damaged the trust between law enforcement and the citizens they swore to protect." He turned his gaze toward the packed courtroom. "For these reasons, I am sentencing each of you to 35 years in federal prison." A sharp gasp rippled through the room. Reporters scrambled to take notes. The families of those wrongfully convicted clenched their fists, some crying in relief. Wallace's face finally twisted in fury, his mask of control shattering. "This is bullshit," he hissed. The bailiff immediately stepped in, restraining him. Mason, on the other hand, simply sank back into his chair, staring at the floor. The gavel slammed down one final time, and just like that, it was over. Their careers, their reputations, their freedom, gone. The department's overhaul. The Arlington Police Department was now a shell of what it had been. Following the scandal, the Justice Department had placed the entire department under federal oversight, ensuring that corruption like Wallace and Mason's would never happen again. Dozens of officers were dismissed or forced into retirement. New leadership was brought in, implementing strict reforms. Body cameras became mandatory, eliminating the possibility of fabricated arrests. A civilian oversight board was established, giving the community a voice in policing policies. It wasn't just damage control, it was a rebirth. For the first time in years, the citizens of Arlington felt like justice had been served, but it had come at a cost, and no one understood that better than Ryan Carter. Ryan's crossroads. Ryan stood in front of his locker, staring at his uniform. For weeks he had gone back and forth in his mind, stay or leave. Some officers still refused to speak to him, treating him like an outsider in his own department. Others had quietly thanked him, telling him he had done the right thing. But Ryan wasn't sure if he belonged anymore. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You thinking of leaving?" He turned. Chief Bryant stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Ryan sighed. "I don't know. Feels like I'm fighting a battle that'll never end." The chief nodded, stepping inside. "It won't." Ryan frowned. Bryant continued. "There will always be people who hate you for what you did. Always people who want to look the other way. But there will also always be people who need you to keep fighting." Ryan looked down at his badge, running a thumb over the polished surface. Maybe the system was broken, but the only way it could be fixed was by people willing to stand up and demand better. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I think I'll stick around a little longer." The chief smirked. "Good." And for the first time since it all began, Ryan felt a sense of purpose. Maya's next mission. At a small cafe on the outskirts of town, Maya Lawson sipped her coffee, watching the news play on a nearby screen. Wallace and Mason sentenced to 35 years, federal oversight imposed on Arlington PD. She smiled slightly. Mission accomplished. Her phone vibrated on the table. She picked it up, glancing at the message. New assignment, briefing at 0600. Maya exhaled, placing a few bills on the table before sliding her coat over her shoulders. The fight wasn't over. It never was. But she was always ready for the next battle. A final thought. As Arlington began to heal, one truth remained. Corruption wasn't just about two dirty cops. It was about a system that had allowed them to exist for years. And while this battle had been won, the war for true justice was far from over. But at least for now, the good guys had won.